The Duke of Branwell said it on their wedding night. He said it standing at the foot of the bed in their chamber at Branwell Hall, still wearing his evening clothes from the wedding breakfast, his cravat loosened but not removed, his hair still arranged in the careful style his valet had achieved that morning. He said it without preamble and without apology, in the tone of a man who had decided in advance that this conversation was best handled with surgical precision rather than with any softening of the truth. "You should understand," he said, "what this marriage is. You are here to produce an heir and nothing more. I do not love you. I will not pretend to love you. We will live separate lives in this house, and when you have given me a son, you will be free to live as you please within the bounds of propriety. I have arranged this with your father. He has accepted the terms. I trust you will do the same." Catherine Branwell, formerly Catherine Westbrook, 22 years old, married to the Duke of Branwell for approximately 7 hours, sat on the edge of the enormous four-poster bed in a nightgown her mother had selected specifically for this evening. Silk, ivory, modest enough to suggest virtue and elegant enough to suggest its imminent surrender. And she looked at her husband with the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood, with absolute clarity, that the life she had been told to expect was not the life she was going to have. The fire crackled in the grate. The candles burned. Outside the tall windows, the November rain was beginning, the kind of fine, persistent rain that would soak the gardens and the gravel drive, and the long avenue of yew trees that had been planted by the third Duke of Branwell 2 centuries ago. Catherine breathed in. She breathed out. She did not weep. She did not protest. She did not, in fact, do anything that the Duke of Branwell, Lord Henry Hastings Branwell, 34 years old, in possession of 3 estates and a seat in the House of Lords, and the kind of cold, exact composure that had been cultivated in him by his late father from approximately the age of 6, appeared to expect. She simply looked at him, and after several seconds of looking, she said, "I see." That was all. 2 words. The Duke, who had perhaps anticipated tears or accusations or the particular kind of stunned protest that his own mother had described to him during her late instructions on how to manage a wedding night, was not entirely prepared for 2 words. He cleared his throat. "I am glad we understand each other," he said. "I shall sleep in the adjoining chamber tonight. We will begin the necessary aspects of this arrangement when you have had time to compose yourself. Tomorrow evening, perhaps, or the evening after, whenever you feel ready." Catherine inclined her head. "Thank you for your consideration, Your Grace." The Duke paused. There was something in her tone that he could not quite identify. It was not bitterness. It was not anger. It was not the wounded acceptance of a young bride being told her marriage was a transaction. It was something colder than any of those things, something that suggested Catherine Branwell was performing the calculation he had just performed and was arriving at conclusions of her own. He chose not to investigate. He bowed slightly, a small, formal bow, as though they were strangers who had been introduced in a drawing room rather than husband and wife, and he left the room through the door that connected to the adjoining chamber. The door clicked shut behind him. Catherine Branwell was alone. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the four-poster bed in her ivory silk nightgown, and she listened to the rain against the windows, and she thought about the conversation that had just occurred. Catherine Westbrook had been raised, like every young woman of her class, to expect a marriage that was a partnership of convenience rather than a love match. Her father, the Earl of Westbrook, was a sensible man with 3 daughters and limited resources, and he had explained to Catherine during her 17th year that her duty would be to marry well, to manage a household, to bear children, and to conduct herself in such a way that her family's name was enhanced rather than diminished by her behavior. She had accepted this. She had been prepared for it. She had not expected love exactly. Love was something that grew in marriages between sensible people, her mother had explained, in the same conversation that her mother had used the previous year to explain to Catherine's elder sister, Anne. Anne had married a viscount and had, after a difficult first year, settled into something that her letters home suggested was at least affectionate, if not passionate. Catherine had been prepared for affection. She had been prepared for the slow, careful work of building a marriage with a man she did not yet know, the way one might build a friendship with a colleague, through shared experience, through patience, through the accumulation of small kindnesses over time. What she had not been prepared for was a husband who informed her on their wedding night that the marriage was a contract for the production of an heir and that affection was not on the agenda. She thought about her father. She thought about her father standing in the church that morning, walking her down the aisle, his expression so carefully composed that Catherine had assumed he was simply moved by the occasion. She understood now, sitting alone in the dark, that her father had known. He had known what kind of marriage he was sending her into. He had accepted the terms. The Duke had said so. She thought about her mother. She thought about her mother fussing over her dress and her hair and her veil that morning, with the particular brittle cheerfulness of a woman who was attempting to convince herself that she had done the right thing. She thought about the way her mother had not quite met her eyes during the wedding breakfast, the way she had been over-attentive to Catherine's plate and to Catherine's wine and to every detail except the actual question of whether Catherine was happy. They had known, both of them. And they had sent her into this anyway, because the alliance was advantageous, and because Catherine was 22 and her younger sister was 18 and would soon need her own season, and because the Westbrook family's position in society had been weakening for 2 generations, and a duke was a duke, regardless of what kind of man occupied the title. Catherine sat in the dark. The rain continued, and somewhere in the long, quiet hours between midnight and dawn, she made several decisions. The first decision was that she would not weep. Not because weeping was forbidden, there was no one in the room to witness it, no reputation to manage, but because weeping would not change anything. And Catherine Branwell, who had inherited from her father the particular Westbrook capacity for cold, methodical thought, had concluded that she was now a woman whose circumstances required strategy rather than emotion. She would weep later, perhaps, when the strategy had borne fruit. For now, she would think. The second decision was that she would not be the wife the Duke had described. She would not be a vessel for the production of an heir. She would not live a separate life in a separate wing while he conducted his affairs and his estates and his own existence as though she were a piece of furniture acquired for a specific purpose. She did not yet know what alternative she would construct, but she knew with absolute certainty that the version of marriage the Duke had outlined was not one she would accept. The third decision was that she would not allow him to see this, not yet. She would behave in every observable way as though she had agreed to his terms. She would attend dinners when required. She would manage the household with the competence her education had prepared her for. She would conduct herself with the cool, formal composure that her position demanded. And while she did all of this, she would observe. She would learn. She would understand the man she had married, the household she had entered, the estates she would now be expected to oversee, and the particular weaknesses and strengths of a duke who had told his bride on their wedding night that he did not love her and would not pretend to. She would understand him, and then she would decide what to do about him. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows, Catherine had stopped sitting on the edge of the bed. She had moved to the writing desk by the window. She had lit a fresh candle, and she was making a list, in the careful, precise hand that her governess had taught her, of every fact she knew about the Duke of Branwell. It was a short list. She had met him 3 times before the wedding, once at the formal introduction arranged by their fathers, once at a dinner at her parents' house in London, and once at a ball where they had danced the obligatory 2 dances and exchanged perhaps 15 sentences. She knew his age, his estates, his title, and his late father's reputation as a man of cold, exacting standards. She knew that his mother had died when he was 12. She knew that he had no siblings. She knew that he had been educated at Eton and Oxford and had served briefly in the diplomatic corps before his father's death had required him to assume his ducal responsibilities. She did not know what books he read. She did not know what subjects interested him. She did not know whether he had ever loved anyone, whether he was capable of loving anyone, whether the cold pronouncement on their wedding night represented the totality of his nature, or whether it was a defense erected against something he had decided long ago not to feel. The list was incomplete. It would need to be expanded. Catherine blew out the candle as the dawn brightened. She returned to the bed. She slept for 2 hours. And when the maid came in at 8 to draw the curtains and lay out her clothes for the day, Catherine was already awake, sitting up against the pillows with the expression of a woman who had not been crying and had not been brooding, but had been simply thinking. The first 3 months of the marriage proceeded according to the Duke's specifications. They dined together when his presence in the house required it, which was perhaps 3 evenings out of 7, and they conducted themselves in front of the staff with the polite formality that had been agreed upon. The staff, for their part, conducted themselves with the careful neutrality of servants who had observed many marriages, and who understood that the new Duchess was being installed into a particular kind of arrangement, and who knew, with the discretion of long practice, not to comment on it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitcomb, who had served the Branwell family for 31 years and had observed the late Duke's marriage to the late Duchess in considerable unflattering detail, treated Catherine with the formal respect due to her position and the quiet, observant kindness that suggested she had drawn her own conclusions about the situation. She did not pry. She did not offer sympathy. But she made certain, in the small ways that a housekeeper can make certain of things, that Catherine's chambers were always warm, that her tea was always the variety she preferred, that the books in the small drawing-room were periodically refreshed from the library to ensure she had something new to read. Catherine noticed all of this. She noticed Mrs. Whitcomb. She noticed the elderly footman, Hawkins, who had been at Branwell Hall for 40 years and who had developed a slight tremor in his left hand that he was attempting to conceal. She noticed the under-housemaid, Sarah, who could not have been more than 15 and who looked perpetually hungry. She did not, in those first months, do anything about any of these observations. She was not yet in a position to do anything. But she filed them away, in the same careful mental ledger where she was filing away her observations of her husband, because she had concluded that knowledge of the household was knowledge that would be useful to her, eventually, when the moment came. He did not visit her chamber for nearly a month after the wedding, which Catherine understood was either an act of consideration on his part or a reflection of the fact that he found the obligation as distasteful as she did. When he finally did visit, the encounter was conducted with the brisk efficiency of two people performing a task that neither of them wished to acknowledge they were performing. He did not speak. She did not speak. He left immediately afterward, returning to his own chamber. She lay awake for 2 hours, staring at the canopy above the bed, and she thought about her sister Anne, who had described her own wedding night in a letter as awkward but not unpleasant, and considerably improved by the morning when my husband brought me tea and asked whether I had slept well. Catherine had received no tea. The Duke had not asked whether she had slept well. He had not, in fact, addressed her directly the following morning at breakfast, except to remark that the post had brought a letter from his solicitor that would require his attention and that he would not be home for dinner. This was, Catherine understood, the marriage. This was what she had been sold into. And in the long, quiet hours of those first months, she observed the Duke of Branwell with the patient attention of a woman who had decided that the only path forward was through understanding. She observed that he rose early before the staff was fully up, and that he took his coffee in the small library on the east side of the house rather than in the breakfast room. She observed that he read 3 newspapers a day, and that he made small, precise notations in the margins with a pencil he kept in his coat pocket. She observed that he was unfailingly courteous to the staff, but that he did not know any of their names except for his valet and his secretary. She observed that he received a great deal of correspondence, and that some of it appeared to trouble him in ways that he managed with careful blankness, but that Catherine, watching him from the other end of the dinner table on the evenings he was present, could now read with increasing accuracy. Something was wrong at one of his estates, something to do with the steward. The Duke was concerned about it, but had not yet decided how to address it. Catherine waited. She waited because she understood that she was a stranger in this house, that her opinions had not been solicited and would not be welcomed, and that the only way to gain ground in a situation where one had been given none was to wait until ground was offered. The opportunity came in February. The Duke had been gone for 3 days, attending to matters at his estate in Yorkshire. He returned on a Thursday evening, exhausted and visibly displeased, and he went directly to his study without speaking to Catherine or the staff. He did not appear at dinner. Catherine ate alone in the dining room, as she had done many times before, and she sent a tray of cold beef and bread to the Duke's study with a note in her own hand that read simply, "Your Grace, should you find yourself in need of refreshment, this is at your disposal. You need not respond. C." It was the first communication of any substance she had sent him. She did not expect a response. She expected him to ignore it, to send the tray back untouched, to perhaps register the gesture as the kind of small managerial efficiency he had married her to provide. He did not ignore it. He came to find her, an hour later, in the small drawing room where she'd been reading. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he said, "Thank you for the tray." "You're welcome. I find I'm uncertain how to proceed with the difficulty I have encountered." "At Yorkshire?" His eyes sharpened. "How did you know it was Yorkshire?" "You have been receiving correspondence from your steward there for 3 weeks. The letters arrive on Mondays and Fridays. You read them at breakfast on the days when you are home. Your expression while reading them has been increasingly displeased. It seemed reasonable to assume that the trip to Yorkshire was related, and that your displeasure on returning indicates the trip did not resolve the matter." A long silence. The Duke continued to stand in the doorway. He looked, Catherine thought, like a man who had discovered something he had not been looking for, and was now obliged to consider whether he wanted to find more of it. "You have been observing me," he said. "Yes." "Why?" Catherine closed her book. She placed it on the small table beside her chair. She folded her hands in her lap, and she made the calculation that she had been preparing to make for 3 months, weighing the risk of honesty against the risk of continuing to play the role she had been assigned. She decided on honesty. "Because," she said, "I have been here for 3 months in a house and a marriage that have given me nothing to do and no purpose to occupy my mind, and observation was the only activity available to me. And because, Your Grace, I am not a woman who does well with idleness, and the alternatives, embroidery, novel reading, the management of menus, were insufficient to occupy my attention. So I observed. I observed you and the staff and the patterns of this household. I have learned a great deal." Another long silence. The Duke walked into the room. He sat down in the chair opposite hers, which was not a chair he had sat in before in the 3 months she had occupied this drawing room. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer unreadable. It was, she thought, careful. The expression of a man who was reconsidering an assumption he had not realized he had made. "What have you learned?" he asked. She told him. She told him about the steward in Yorkshire, who she suspected was either incompetent or actively deceitful based on the pattern of correspondence she had observed. She told him about the housekeeper at Branwell Hall, who was efficient, but who had been over-ordering candles for the past 2 months in quantities that suggested either theft or a misunderstanding about consumption. She told him that the under-gardener had been ill for 3 weeks, and that the head gardener had not yet hired a replacement, which would create problems when spring planting began. She told him that his secretary, while competent, had developed the habit of opening correspondence that should have been delivered unopened, and the 2 letters from the House of Lords had been received with seal marks suggesting they had been read by hands other than the Duke's. She delivered all of this in a calm, factual tone, the way one might deliver a report on the weather. She did not editorialize. She did not suggest solutions. She simply presented the observations as observations, and she allowed the Duke to draw his own conclusions about what to do with them. The Duke did not interrupt her. He listened. When she had finished, he sat in silence for nearly a minute. Then he said, "I have been a fool." "I would not say that, Your Grace." "I would. I have been managing this household and these estates with the assumption that the work could be conducted without my attention to detail, because I have had other matters to occupy me. I have allowed problems to develop because I did not see them, and I have failed to notice that I have been married for 3 months to a woman who has noticed all of them." A pause. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" "You did not ask." Something flickered across his face. It might have been embarrassment. It might have been something more complicated. "Catherine," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For everything I said on our wedding night." She looked at him steadily. She did not let her composure slip, because she understood that this was the moment when slippage would be most dangerous. "Your Grace," she said, "I do not require an apology. I require honesty about how this marriage will proceed from this point forward. I have been here 3 months. I have watched you manage your estates and your household with the assumption that I am not a person who can contribute to either. I have a mind. I have an education. I have, as you have just observed, a capacity for attention that you appear to lack. If you wish me to be a producer of heirs and nothing more, I will continue to perform that role with the precision you have requested. But if you would consider an alternative arrangement, one in which my mind is also engaged in the running of this house and these estates, I would be open to discussing it." She paused. "The choice is yours." The Duke looked at her for a long time. Catherine looked back. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Somewhere in the house, a footman closed a door. "I would like," the Duke said slowly, "to discuss it." Catherine inclined her head. "Then we shall discuss it. Tomorrow morning, perhaps, after breakfast. I have observations about the Yorkshire situation that may be of use to you." She stood. She picked up her book. She walked past him to the door. And as she reached the threshold, she paused, and she turned back. And she said, with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the conversation, "Your Grace, there is one further matter." "Yes?" "I would prefer, going forward, that you visit my chamber only when you have spoken with me during the day. The arrangement we have had, in which you appear without warning and depart without speaking, is not one I wish to continue. If we are to produce an heir, we will do so as two people who have at least exchanged a sentence about the weather. Do you understand?" The Duke stood. He looked at her. He nodded slowly. "I understand. Thank you. Good night, Your Grace." She left the drawing room. She walked up the staircase to her chamber. She closed the door behind her. And only then, when she was alone with the door locked and the candle blown out, and the November rain beginning again against the windows, did Catherine Branwell allow herself to sit on the edge of her bed and breathe. The marriage had not, by any reasonable measure, become a love match, but it had become, perhaps, a partnership. And that, she thought as she pulled the covers up over her, was considerably more than she had expected at dawn that morning, when she had been a woman with no agency at all in a house that did not know her name. The transformation of the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Branwell did not happen quickly. It happened slowly, over the course of a year, through a series of small accumulated changes that began with the conversation in the drawing room and proceeded through the careful work of two people learning to occupy the same life rather than two adjacent lives that did not touch. The Duke, to his considerable credit, did not retreat. He did not, after that conversation, return to his original assumption that Catherine was a transaction. He listened to her observations about Yorkshire. He took her advice, which was to dismiss the steward and replace him with the head gardener's brother, a man who had managed a smaller estate in Cumbria with notable competence. He consulted her about the housekeeper, the secretary, the under-gardener, and a dozen other matters that he had previously handled alone. And in the evenings, when he came home from London or from his estates, he began to come to the small drawing room where Catherine sat reading, and he began to sit in the chair opposite hers, and they began to talk. They talked about estate management. They talked about politics. They talked, eventually, about books. He preferred history. She preferred poetry. But they discovered an unexpected common ground in philosophy, particularly the work of David Hume. They argued. They disagreed. They learned to argue and disagree without it becoming personal, which was, the Duke remarked one evening, a skill he had not previously possessed and had not realized he was missing. The Duke's nighttime visits to her chamber, as Catherine had requested, were now preceded by conversation. The conversation was sometimes brief, a comment about the day's events, a question about her health, and sometimes longer, but it was always present, and over the months it became something neither of them had anticipated. It became affection, not passion exactly, not yet, but the kind of affection that grows in marriages between two people who have learned, slowly and with effort, to see each other. The Duke wept on the night she told him she was with child. They had been married for nearly a year. Catherine had suspected for several weeks. She had wanted to be certain before she told him, because she understood, with the same calm, strategic intelligence she had brought to every aspect of this marriage, that the announcement would change things. It would shift the balance of the household. It would activate every assumption about her primary purpose that the Duke had articulated on their wedding night. She wanted to choose the moment. She chose a Thursday evening in late October. They had finished dinner. They had retired to the small drawing room. The fire was lit. The Duke was reading a report from his solicitor. Catherine was working on a piece of correspondence to her sister Anne. She set down her pen. She said, "Henry, there's something I would like to tell you." It was the first time she had used his Christian name. He looked up from his report. He registered immediately that something significant was about to be said. "I'm with child," Catherine said. The Duke set down the report. He set it down very carefully, as though it had become extremely fragile. He stood. He crossed the room. He knelt beside her chair, which was not something he had ever done before, And he took her hands in his, and Catherine watched the composure that had been the defining feature of his face for 34 years simply dissolve. He wept, not the quiet, contained weeping of a man embarrassed to be moved. The full, unguarded weeping of a man who had discovered, in the space of a single sentence, that the life he had been living had been entirely insufficient and that something larger and more important had just opened in front of him. Catherine held his hands. She did not weep. She had decided 11 months ago that she would weep later. This was not yet later, though she could feel later approaching. "Henry," she said. "Catherine," he said. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For everything. For the wedding night. For 3 months of treating you as though you were a function rather than a person. For believing, for 34 years, that affection was a weakness I could not afford. For being too late to be the husband you deserved at the beginning, and too fortunate to deserve being the husband you have made me into now." Catherine looked at him. She looked at the man she had married, the cold, exact composure dissolving in the firelight, the Duke of Branwell weeping on his knees in front of her chair. And she felt, for the first time since she had woken on her wedding morning 11 months ago, the loosening of something in her chest that she had not realized she'd been holding. "Henry," she said, "stand up, sit beside me. Tell me what kind of father you would like to be." He stood. He sat beside her. He took her hand. And he began to talk, hesitantly at first and then with increasing certainty about the kind of father he wanted to be. Present, attentive, the opposite of his own father in nearly every respect. Catherine listened. She made suggestions. She corrected him gently when his ideas about fatherhood revealed gaps in his understanding of children, which were considerable. They talked until the fire had burned down to embers and the candles were guttering. And when they finally rose to go upstairs, the Duke kissed her forehead in the doorway of the drawing room, and it was the first time he had kissed her with anything resembling tenderness. And Catherine, who had been waiting 11 months for this moment without knowing she was waiting, allowed it and even perhaps returned it slightly, which was as close as she could come to weeping while still maintaining her composure. The Duke and Duchess of Branwell had 3 children over the course of the following 6 years, 2 sons and a daughter. The first son, who would inherit the dukedom, was named Edward after Catherine's father, a small but deliberate choice on the Duke's part, who had understood by then that Catherine's father, whatever his sins in arranging the marriage, was a man who had raised a daughter capable of constructing a life out of impossible circumstances, and that the name Edward in his son would be a small acknowledgment of that achievement. The second son was named Thomas, after no one in particular, because by the time he was born, the Duke and Duchess had relaxed sufficiently into their partnership to choose names based on their actual preferences rather than on family obligation, and they had both agreed that Thomas was a good, sturdy name that would serve a boy well throughout his life. The daughter, born last, was named Margaret, after the Duke's mother, who had been dead for 27 years when her granddaughter was born, and who, the Duke believed, would have approved of the choice. The Duke had spoken of his mother only twice in the course of the marriage, both times late at night and both times after considerable conversation about other things. Catherine had listened to both accounts without comment. She had understood from those 2 careful, bounded confessions that the cold, exact composure that had defined the Duke's manner before their marriage had been a defense erected at 12 years old against the loss of the only person who had ever shown him affection, and that the man who had told her on their wedding night that he could not afford love had been, in some essential sense, a frightened boy who had spent 22 years convincing himself that the absence of love was a strength. The marriage that had begun on a wedding night with a transactional declaration had become, by the time the children were born, the kind of marriage that the Duke's friends in the House of Lords commented on with a mixture of admiration and quiet envy. The Duke and Duchess were rarely apart. They oversaw the estates together, with Catherine taking responsibility for the management of household affairs and the tenant relations, while the Duke handled the financial and political matters. They corresponded daily when his duties required him to be in London, and she remained at Branwell Hall with the children. The letters they wrote to each other during those separations would, 2 centuries later, be discovered by a great-great-great-grandson clearing out a trunk in the attic, and would be published as a slim volume that critics would describe as the most unexpectedly tender correspondence in the historical record of an arranged marriage. The Duke never spoke, after that night in October when Catherine told him she was with child, of his original declaration on their wedding night. Catherine never reminded him of it. They did not need to discuss it, because they had both, by that point, become people who were no longer recognizable as the two strangers who had stood at the foot of a four-poster bed 11 months earlier. The Duke had become, over the course of the marriage, a man who was capable of love. Catherine had become a woman who had constructed, out of nothing more than careful observation and patient strategy, and the absolute refusal to accept the role she had been assigned, a marriage and a life that were entirely her own. Years later, when their eldest son was 12 and beginning to ask questions about how his parents had come to marry, Catherine told him only that his father and she had been introduced by their families and had grown to love each other through long acquaintance. It was not a lie. It was simply not the whole truth. The whole truth. The wedding night declaration, the 3 months of cold formality, the conversation in the drawing room, the slow and difficult work of building affection from terms that had explicitly excluded it, was a story Catherine had decided long ago to keep for herself. It was, she thought, hers. And in the careful keeping of it, in the choice not to weaponize it against the man who had become her partner, she had achieved the final and most important thing she had set out to achieve on the night of her wedding. She had become a woman whose life was determined by her own decisions rather than by the declarations of any man, however powerful. And the Duke of Branwell, who had told his bride on their wedding night that she was here to produce an heir and nothing more, lived the rest of his life as a man whose every important decision was made in consultation with his wife, and who understood, with quiet daily gratitude, that the most fortunate thing that had ever happened to him was the moment a young woman named Catherine Westbrook had looked at him across a four-poster bed and decided not to weep.